A woman abandoned her 83-year-old mother-in-law in the middle of the road, intending to take her inheritance. Later, the elderly woman showed up at the family dinner, and what happened next will shock you. The golden clock on the wall of the Alves mansion's grand living room marked precisely 4:50 p.m. Each tick of the second hand echoed in the luxurious yet lifeless space, as if the room itself were trapped in a timeless freeze. Marcia sat on the pristine white leather sofa, her hands resting in her lap. Her gaze wandered absently over the lavish details around her. Crystal chandeliers hanging like suspended works of art, Persian rugs too flawless to be stepped on, and sculptures that made the room feel more like a gallery than a home. Everything in the space screamed wealth and power, but to Marcia it was nothing more than a gilded cage. She sighed deeply, adjusting the dress she had chosen so carefully that afternoon. The outfit was sophisticated, impossibly expensive, and paid for with money that wasn't hers. In truth, nothing here belonged to her. Not the furniture, not the paintings, and certainly not respect. It all belonged to Donna Dulce. Even the mere thought of her mother-in-law sent a shiver down Marcia's spine. Dulce was formidable, controlling, a woman with an almost supernatural ability to humiliate without raising her voice. From the moment Marcia set foot in the mansion, Dulce had become a looming shadow, a constant reminder that Marcia would never truly belong. For a woman like you, being allowed here should already be enough, Dulce had remarked during Marcia's first family dinner. The words were delivered with a cold smile that never reached her eyes and a pointed glance at Fabiano, as if he were nothing more than a pawn in her private game. The message was unmistakable. His choice to marry Marcia was an affront to Dulce. Fabiano, despite being a grown man and Marcia's husband, remained utterly tethered to his mother. He sought Dulce's approval for everything, from investment decisions to the color of his office curtains. It was as though Fabiano existed solely as an extension of his mother's will. And Marcia, she was simply a misplaced piece in Dulce's unyielding game. As Marcia adjusted her earrings, the unmistakable sound of Donna Dulce's confident footsteps echoed through the hallway. Moments later, Dulce swept into the room, poised and polished as always, dressed in a silk ensemble that radiated luxury. Her signature perfume, impossibly expensive and overpowering, filled the air. Marcia barely managed to suppress a grimace. That scent, much like Dulce's presence, had become something she couldn't stand. Dulce seemed to dominate every corner of the house, her aura of superiority and disdain leaving Marcia feeling suffocated. "Marcia, darling," Dulce began, her voice dripping with a sugary venom that made Marcia's teeth clench. "I asked you to oversee tonight's dinner, but apparently I also need to remind you that the caviar should be served before the champagne." That look on Dulce's face, part smile, part superiority, was Marcia's undoing. Every word her mother-in-law uttered felt like a judgment, a decree handed down from the woman who ruled this household. And as always, Marcia could do nothing but bow her head, swallow her pride, and accept the reality that her voice was barely a whisper in a house where Dulce's words carried all the weight. Marcia gave a small nod, forcing herself to remain calm when all she wanted was to scream. She knew, no matter how hard she tried, nothing would ever satisfy her mother-in-law. Of course, Dulce reveled in that. Marcia could feel it in every smug glance, every carefully placed remark. Dulce's entire presence seemed designed to remind her she didn't belong, that she never would. Before Marcia could fully absorb her simmering anger, Fabiano walked into the room. His distracted smile felt like a weak attempt to diffuse the tension that always ignited between his wife and his mother. He knew exactly what was going on, but he chose to look the other way. To Marcia, his indifference wasn't just frustrating, it felt like betrayal. The lump in her throat threatened to choke her, but she wouldn't let them see her break. Rising from the couch, Marcia muttered something about a prior engagement and hurried out of the room. She climbed the stairs quickly, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and slipped into the bedroom, locking the door behind her. As she collapsed onto the bed, Marcia stared blankly at the ceiling, letting the anger and humiliation churn within her. The bitter thoughts she had suppressed for so long bubbled to the surface. How many times had she swallowed her pride? How many times had she felt like a charity case disguised as a family member? The weight of the frustration she had carried for years made her chest rise and fall in heavy breaths. She pushed herself up and walked to the window, gazing at the impeccably manicured garden below. The sky, painted in shades of orange and red by the setting sun, looked like an image of perfection, almost like a work of art. To anyone else, this would be the picture of happiness, a woman married to a wealthy man, living in a dream mansion. But for Marcia, it was nothing but a gilded prison. Everything appeared flawless from the outside, but inside she felt trapped, suffocated by a marriage that didn't feel like hers and a life that seemed to belong entirely to Dulcie. That's when it struck her like lightning cutting through a storm. An idea. She needed to break free. And to do that, Dulcie had to go. It wasn't just a desire, it was survival. As long as Dulcie held the reins, Marcia would never truly be free. Dulce didn't just control the house, or Fabiano. She dictated Marcia's every move. The only way to escape this gilded cage was to remove the matriarch from the equation. Marcia returned to the bed, pulled open one of the large drawers, and retrieved a small notebook she had hidden there. Sitting back against the headboard, she began to write. Her thoughts, her ideas, possible plans. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew one thing. Dulcie had always underestimated her. And that would be Marcia's greatest advantage. In the days that followed, Marcia turned into an observer. She studied Dulcie, noting her habits, her routines, the moments when her guard was down. She recorded everything with a cold precision that surprised even herself. Fabiano would never suspect anything. To him, Marcia was the perfect wife, obedient and devoted. And Dulce, for all her cunning, would never imagine that Marcia could muster the courage to defy her. This underestimation would be Marcia's most powerful weapon. The thought of freedom burned within her like an unstoppable flame. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcia was resolute. She would do whatever it took to reclaim her life. That night, at dinner, Dulce made a cutting remark about Marcia's dress. Fabiano, ever the peacemaker, let out a nervous laugh, trying to smooth over the tension. But Marcia remained silent. For the first time, she didn't care. She didn't flinch. As Dulcie smiled, clearly savoring what she thought was yet another victory in her game of humiliation, Marcia watched her with an unnerving calm. It wasn't indifference. It was something far more potent. Behind her silence, a plan was taking shape. The Alves mansion awoke the next morning in its usual tranquility, punctuated only by the whistle of the kettle in the kitchen. But Marcia knew this quiet would soon be shattered forever. This time, she would be the one writing the story's ending. Seated at the kitchen table, a black notebook open in front of her, Marcia appeared lost in thought. To anyone passing by, she might seem distracted, her mind adrift. But every word she scribbled was deliberate. Each note was another step toward what she called her final freedom. Over the months, the plan had evolved in her mind, growing sharper and more precise. Now, as she reviewed it once again, a mix of nervous energy and steely resolve filled her. She couldn't afford any mistakes. Every detail had to feel organic, as if it were all part of an unplanned, natural course of events. Above all, Marcia had to sell her role, the doting daughter-in-law who only wanted to help her mother-in-law regain her health. It was a flawless performance, and Marcia took a certain satisfaction in playing it. A faint, cold smile flickered across her lips as she mentally rehearsed the next steps. Suddenly, Fabiano walked into the kitchen, adjusting his tie. He seemed more rushed than usual, but paused just long enough to sit beside her. He placed a quick kiss on her forehead and greeted her warmly. "Good morning, my love. Did you sleep well?" She glanced up, offering him a faint smile that concealed the storm of thoughts raging in her head. "Yes, I did," she replied smoothly, picking up an apple from the fruit bowl. "But I've been a little worried about your mother," she added, her tone casual. "Don't you think she's been cooped up in the house for too long? Maybe it'd be good for her to get out a bit. A walk, perhaps?" Her voice was perfectly measured, light, unassuming, impossible to misinterpret as anything but a thoughtful suggestion. Fabiano nodded absent-mindedly, as he often did, completely missing the layers beneath her words. To him, Marcia was simply a kind, attentive wife, concerned about his mother's well-being. And that was precisely what Marcia needed him to believe. Later, at breakfast with Dulcie, Marcia set the first part of her plan into motion. Pouring tea with care, her movements deliberate and gentle, she brought up the idea of a stroll, cloaking her suggestion in concern for Dulcie's health. She spoke of the benefits of fresh air, of breaking routine, her words laced with a sincerity that was impossible to doubt. It was the perfect first move in a game Dulcie didn't even realize she was playing. "Donna Dulce, what do you say we go for a drive? Something to shake up the routine," Marcia suggested, her voice light and inviting. Dulce glanced up, clearly taken aback, but Marcia had already sown the idea. Her kind tone and carefully measured gestures left little room for suspicion. Inside, though, Marcia felt a surge of satisfaction. Every word, every action was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. The game was in motion, and the pieces were starting to fall into place. Dulce's gaze fixed on Marcia, sharp and scrutinizing, like a predator assessing its prey. There was always something calculated about the way Dulce looked at her, as if she were searching for weaknesses to exploit. "A drive?" Dulce repeated, her voice laced with distrust. She didn't bother hiding it. "Since when do you care about me?" Marcia didn't rush her response. This was a game she had learned to play well. Any act of kindness she offered was met with cynicism, but over time she had mastered the art of staying composed. "I just thought we could all use some fresh air," Marcia said at last, her expression calm and her smile practiced. "A change of scenery can do wonders for the spirit, don't you think?" Dulce let out a dry, brittle laugh, the kind that always made Marcia's skin crawl. But to her surprise, the matriarch agreed. "Fine," Dulce said, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. "Let's see if you're as devoted as you pretend to be." That night, alone in her room, Marcia went over every detail of her plan yet again. But as she reviewed the steps, a nagging feeling crept in, a faint, persistent guilt. No matter how much she despised Dulce, what she was planning felt drastic, almost irreversible. What if something went wrong? What if Fabiano found out? What if she herself couldn't handle the weight of what she was about to do? But every time those doubts threatened to overwhelm her, Marcia forced herself to remember. She thought about the years of humiliation, the countless times she'd been treated like an outsider in Dulce's home. She remembered the matriarch's cold, judgmental stares, her sharp words meant to remind Marcia of her supposed inferiority. And then she imagined a life without Dulce, a life where she was free to breathe, free to make her own choices. That vision was enough to push the guilt aside. The days leading up to the drive were fraught with tension. Marcia did her best to appear normal, but every interaction with Dulce felt like a test. The matriarch seemed to sense that something was different. Her remarks became more pointed, her tone sharper than usual. "You know," Dulce said one evening at dinner, her voice dripping with condescension, "sometimes I think Fabiano could have found someone more fitting for our family." "Mother, don't be so harsh," Fabiano protested with an awkward laugh, though he didn't truly reprimand her. "But I see your point." Marcia gripped the edge of the tablecloth, her fingers trembling with restrained fury. She bit her tongue, forcing herself not to react. Not now. That night, as she lay beside Fabiano, unable to sleep, Dulce's words echoed in her mind. They mingled with memories of years spent enduring disdain and cruelty. The weight of her plan pressed heavily on her, but alongside it came a certainty. There was no other way out. The next morning, Marcia woke before everyone else. The day had arrived. Everything was meticulously planned, every detail considered. As she poured herself a cup of coffee and checked the schedule for the outing, A strange calm settled over her, as though the universe itself had decided to grant her a brief reprieve. The sky was a deep, flawless blue, but inside her, clouds of anxiety continued to gather. She took a long shower, letting the water steady her nerves, and then carefully chose her outfit, a simple white blouse and comfortable pants, deliberately understated. Every movement she made felt heavy with significance, as though each step was drawing her closer to an irreversible fate. Meanwhile, Dulcie was true to form, her biting mood evident from the moment she appeared in the kitchen. She carried herself with the same imperious demeanor, her sharp eyes scanning the room, as though everything around her fell short of her standards. "I hope this little outing is worth my time," Dulcie remarked, her voice laced with disdain. "I have far more important things to do than wander aimlessly in the middle of nowhere." Marcia smiled politely, swallowing the bitterness that threatened to rise in her throat. "It'll do you good, Donna Dulce. Fresh air and peace can work wonders," she replied, her tone measured and calm, as if nothing could rattle her. It wasn't long before they were in the car. Marcia gripped the steering wheel firmly, her knuckles white against the leather, while Dulcie sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the passing scenery with a look of barely concealed contempt. The winding roads pulled them further from the city, drawing them toward the hills Marcia had carefully chosen for this moment. "I'm not sure you even know where you're going," Dulcie muttered, her words cutting like a blade. "It's probably the first time you've tried to organize something without completely messing it up." Marcia took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain her composure. She gave a faint smile that barely masked the resentment simmering beneath the surface. Control was everything now. Her plan depended on it. With every mile that took them further from the city's bustle, the tension inside the car grew heavier. Dulce alternated between sarcastic jabs and complaints about the discomfort of the trip, her words battering Marcia like an endless stream of blows. But Marcia kept her focus on the road, her gaze unwavering despite the erratic pounding of her heart. Finally, after an hour of driving, the destination came into view. A desolate spot surrounded by trees and rolling hills, far removed from any sign of other cars or people. It was exactly as Marcia had envisioned, isolated, quiet, and perfect. Slowing the car down, Marcia pretended to admire the view. "What is this?" Dulcie snapped, her eyes narrowing with suspicion and disdain. "I thought we were going somewhere decent, not this godforsaken place." "I thought it might be nice to stop here for a moment," Marcia replied, parking the car at the side of the road. "The view is beautiful, don't you think?" Dulcie scoffed, her face etched with disapproval. "This is what you call a beautiful view? Honestly, Marcia, your idea of leisure is pathetic." Marcia ignored the barb and stepped out of the car, determined to keep her composure. She retrieved a water bottle and a small towel from the trunk, her mind racing. Now or never, she thought. Taking a deep breath, she steadied herself before returning to Dulcie. "Let's stretch our legs. A short walk will do us good," she said, her voice calm but insistent. Dulce grumbled, but eventually slid out of the car, leaning heavily on the door for support. Marcia watched as the older woman adjusted her coat, her movements slow and deliberate. They walked a short distance along the dirt path, Dulcie's incessant complaints breaking the stillness. "This is absurd. There's nothing here but trees. Do you really think this is relaxing?" Marcia stopped suddenly, her heart pounding as adrenaline surged through her. Her hands trembled, but she clenched them into fists, drawing strength from the moment. "Maybe you need a moment to yourself," Marcia said, her tone steady, though her voice carried an edge Dulcie hadn't heard before. Before Dulcie could respond, Marcia turned and walked briskly back toward the car. Dulcie called out, her voice sharp with authority, but Marcia didn't look back. She climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove off without hesitation. For a few moments, Dulcie's shouts echoed in the distance, but soon the sound was swallowed by the silence of the deserted road. Marcia gripped the steering wheel tightly, her heart racing, thundering against her ribs. She could hardly believe what she'd just done. A torrent of emotions flooded her mind: relief, fear, disbelief. It was done. There was no undoing it now. She drove in silence, the road stretching endlessly before her as if time itself had paused. By the time she returned to the mansion, the housekeeper greeted her at the door, her expression concerned. "Mrs. Marcia, are you all right? You look tired." Marcia forced a weak smile, crafting the perfect mask of worry. "I'm just a bit anxious about Donna Dulce. She wanted some time to herself. She should have been back by now." The rest of the day was a blur of forced normalcy. Marcia busied herself with trivial tasks, all the while revisiting the image of that desolate road. What if someone saw the car? What if they found her? The questions swirled in her mind, a storm she couldn't escape. Fear crept in, its weight pressing heavily on her chest. But alongside it, something else emerged, a newfound sense of control, tentative, yet intoxicating. For the first time, the oppressive echo of Dulce's voice was gone, replaced by a quiet she hadn't known in years. Still, the calm was fragile, as if it could shatter at the slightest touch. The silence she had longed for now loomed over her, a double-edged sword. Her relief felt precarious, balanced on the edge of uncertainty, and Marcia knew that the price of her actions was only beginning to reveal itself. The next morning, the house seemed to fall back into its usual rhythm, as though nothing had changed. Marcia stood in the kitchen, stirring coffee as an old song hummed on the radio. Her hands shook just slightly, causing the spoon to clink against the porcelain mug. "Stay calm," she told herself, forcing a deep breath. Fabiano walked into the room, his phone in one hand and his tie askew as usual. Marcia managed a quick smile, careful to keep her face from revealing the storm inside her. "Have you seen my mother?" he asked, his eyes glued to the screen as he skimmed a message. Marcia sipped her coffee, masking the growing tension in her chest. "No, maybe she went for a walk and lost track of time." Fabiano didn't seem to think much of her answer. Dulce was known for doing as she pleased without informing anyone. Marcia felt a fleeting wave of relief at his lack of concern, but the moment shattered as the piercing sound of his phone's ringtone broke the air. He answered quickly, but as he listened, his expression darkened. "What? Where?" he said, his voice tight with worry. Marcia froze, a cold sweat prickling at her spine. Her heart pounded as Fabiano ended the call, his face pale. "It's the police," he said, his voice uneven. "They found my mother. She's in the hospital." Marcia almost dropped her mug, but she forced herself to stay steady. She needed to think fast. "The hospital? Oh my God. What happened?" she asked, her tone carefully laced with shock and concern. Fabiano didn't answer, already grabbing his car keys. Marcia followed him, her mind racing. Something went wrong. Something went terribly wrong. When they arrived at the hospital, a nurse led them to Dulce's room. Marcia trailed behind Fabiano, her face set in a mask of worry. Inside, they found Dulce sitting up in bed, her face weary, but her gaze sharp, radiating anger. "Mom!" Fabiano rushed to her side, clutching her hands. "What happened? Where were you?" Dulce's cold, cutting eyes locked on Marcia. "Where was I? Why don't you ask your wife? She knows exactly where she left me." Her words hit like a thunderclap. Fabiano froze, his wide eyes darting between his mother and Marcia, completely bewildered. "What is she talking about?" Marcia felt her knees threaten to give way, but she forced herself to smile faintly, keeping her voice steady. "I don't know, Fabiano. She went out alone. I thought she just wanted some fresh air." Dulce let out a bitter, scornful laugh that seemed to echo in the small room. "Fresh air? She abandoned me on a deserted road. If it weren't for a passing truck driver, I wouldn't be here to tell you this." Fabiano blinked, struggling to absorb his mother's accusations. His gaze shifted back to Marcia, searching for clarity, an explanation, anything to make sense of what he was hearing. "Tell me this isn't true," he said, his voice trembling, a mix of disbelief and anger rising with each word. Marcia took a step back, her mind scrambling for an excuse, a way to explain herself and escape the suffocating pressure of the moment. "Of course not. This has to be a misunderstanding," she said, her voice trembling just enough to seem sincere. "I just took your mother out for some fresh air. She wanted to get out of the car and walk by herself. I would never abandon her like that. Fabiano's gaze darted between Marcia and his mother, his emotions a storm of conflict. Love for one, loyalty to the other, it all churned within him. Before he could speak, the officer in the room interrupted the tense silence. "Mr. Alves, we'll need to investigate this further. Mrs. Dulcie has given us a consistent statement, but we have protocols to follow. Mrs. Marcia, we'll need to hear your version of events." Marcia's stomach churned, as if panic were clawing its way up from the depths. She tried to appear calm, but inside she felt the walls closing in. What would happen now? Fabiano's eyes stayed locked on her, waiting for the truth she couldn't bring herself to admit. The tension broke as Dulcie's voice cut through the air, sharp and laced with venom. "Say whatever you want, Marcia, but I know exactly what you tried to do. And mark my words, everyone else will know too." Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was unbearable. Since they had left the hospital, Fabiano hadn't said a single word to Marcia. She had tried to explain, to justify herself, but every attempt felt hollow against the backdrop of her husband's disappointment. "I just want the truth, Marcia," Fabiano finally said, his voice thick with pain he struggled to hide. "Was it you? Did you leave my mother there?" Marcia hesitated. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy enough to weigh them both down. Unable to endure it any longer, Fabiano's voice cracked as he exploded. "She ruins everything around us. She controls my life, Marcia. I just wanted a little peace." He buried his face in his hands, as though trying to erase his own words, but they lingered, sharp and unyielding. "And your solution was to leave her stranded in the middle of nowhere. Do you have any idea what could have happened? She could have died." Marcia didn't respond. She knew there was no point. No excuse would ever be enough to erase the damage. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was already buzzing with rumors. Salette, the ever-nosy neighbor, had learned about the incident through one of the mansion's staff. True to form, she wasted no time spinning her own tale and spreading it around. To Salette, Marcia had always been a dangerous woman, calculating and capable of anything to get what she wanted. As the story passed from one mouth to another, it morphed, growing darker with every retelling, fueled by the sharp tongues of the community. When Marcia learned of the gossip, she realized the battle wasn't just with Fabiano or the police anymore. Now it felt like the world was turning against her. Trapped, cornered, she knew surrender wasn't an option. The real fight was only beginning, and she had to think fast to protect herself. The investigation into the roadside incident began quietly, but quickly escalated. Unexpected details about Dulcie's past began to surface, further complicating an already tangled situation. What had initially seemed like a cruel act of abandonment now hinted at something far more sinister. As the police dug deeper into the Alves family, they uncovered suspicious financial transactions tied to Dulcie. Large sums of money had been funneled into offshore accounts, many linked to shell companies. What began as Marcia's desperate attempt to escape Dulcie's oppressive grip was now spiraling into something much larger, a web of secrets, lies, and betrayal that threatened to destroy everything. Fabiano had always seen his mother as a pillar of virtue, but now he was called in for questioning. The revelations shattered him. Suddenly, the woman he had idolized his entire life didn't seem so flawless anymore. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves knew that what was about to unfold would change everything forever. Marcia, under house arrest, paced the room endlessly, trying to organize her thoughts, looking for a way to defend herself. The venomous words of Dulcie still echoed in her mind, like a constant whisper. "I'll make sure you pay for what you did." But contrary to what she expected, things were taking an unexpected turn. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had always controlled everything, seemed to have her own secrets to hide. On the third day of the investigation, the police called Julia, the housemaid, to testify. For years, Julia had been a quiet presence in the Alves household, always attentive to the details, but never getting involved in the family's conflicts. However, under pressure from the investigators, she finally decided to speak. "Donna Dulce isn't quite the person everyone thinks she is," Julia began, her voice steady, as she looked directly at the officers watching her closely. "For years, she forced me to keep secrets, and they weren't small ones." The officers, now alert, leaned forward, eager to hear more. Without hesitation, Julia began to reveal what she knew. She spoke of how the matriarch, Donna Dulce, had maintained a toxic and manipulative relationship with her brother, Carlos Mendonça. Even after he was disinherited by Dulce's own decision, the story was far from simple. Julia told the police that for years, Donna Dulce had blackmailed Carlos, threatening to expose a financial scandal involving his company. In return, he had been forced to stay silent and obey her every command. Julia's voice wavered slightly as she continued, her gaze uneasy. "She'd have me deliver documents to Carlos several times. She always called it a favor, but I knew there was something much bigger going on behind it. Donna Dulce was manipulative, even with me." With this new information, the investigators began to piece together the connections between what Julia had said and the suspicious financial transactions they had uncovered. It became clear that Donna Dulce wasn't just a strict, controlling matriarch. She had been operating in the shadows, using her power to protect her wealth and maintain control over everyone around her. Meanwhile, Fabiano was called in again for questioning. When he sat down with the officers, he seemed lost, struggling to process the new revelations about his mother while trying to make sense of what was really happening within his own home. One of the officers, holding a stack of papers, asked the question Fabiano had feared. "Were you aware of these activities?" the officer asked, handing over documents that linked Donna Dulce to illegal transactions. Fabiano flipped through the papers, his eyes wide in disbelief. "No, I had no idea," he said, his voice faltering. "My mother always handled the family's finances. I trusted her completely." The officers exchanged looks before continuing. "It's important for you to understand that these discoveries place the entire family under suspicion, including your wife." Fabiano looked up, confusion written all over his face. He pointed at Marcia as if it were impossible that she had anything to do with this. "What does Marcia have to do with this?" he asked, his tone incredulous. "There's evidence suggesting she might have discovered these activities and tried to use them to her advantage. We need to understand if the incident on the road is connected to these financial secrets." Fabiano went silent, his mind racing. The idea that Marcia might be conspiring against his mother felt distant, yet it wasn't entirely impossible. He knew she had her resentments, but this new twist left him more lost than ever, struggling to comprehend what was really happening. Meanwhile, in the neighborhood, Salete, the nosy neighbor, was already on her own mission, eager to dig deeper into the situation. With her connections in the local community, it didn't take long for her to catch wind of Julia's statements, and she decided to go digging herself. It wasn't long before she appeared at the mansion, determined to confront Marcia. "You know, Marcia," Salete began, her voice dripping with smugness as she settled onto the sofa, "I've always known your life here wasn't exactly easy, but all these secrets about Dulce, it's a scandal, even for her." Marcia, drained from trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, let out a heavy sigh. She knew her life would never be the same. The storm had already broken, and no one was safe from the fallout. "I don't care what you have to say," Marcia replied, her voice flat and tinged with weariness. "I've got enough problems as it is." I know, Salete continued, undeterred, her smile widening. "But maybe you should listen to me. I just found something important. Dulce's brother is still alive, and he's got a lot to say about her. This could be your way out." Marcia blinked, taken aback, not understanding what Salete was getting at. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her confusion growing. Salete leaned forward, a look of triumph on her face. "What I mean is, if Dulce's secrets come to light, you might not be seen as the villain in all this. Maybe everyone will finally realize that the real culprit has always been her, The words hit Marcia hard. For the first time in a long while, something inside her stirred. As the revelations about Dulce began to spread, the image of the ruthless matriarch began to crack. The woman who had always been the unquestionable figure of the family was now being questioned. Yet Marcia's situation remained complicated. Even if the new facts painted her as a victim, her actions against Dulce were still seen by many as an attempt to rid herself of an obstacle. That night, Fabiano returned home, consumed by a whirlwind of emotions. Each step toward the mansion only deepened his doubts, but it also intensified his confusion. When he finally saw Marcia, something shifted inside him. Despite everything that had happened, he could no longer see her as the sole culprit. There were too many secrets, too many lies woven over the years. His mother, the woman he had always believed to be untouchable, had been hiding all of this while systematically tearing everything apart around her. As the stillness of the night enveloped the mansion, Marcia felt for the first time that maybe there was a chance to turn her life around. But at the same time, she knew that what was coming next would be decisive. Everything she had done up until this point had brought her to this moment, and now, more than ever, she needed to be prepared to face the consequences of her choices. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the house like a thunderclap. Marcia, who had been in her room reading through documents her lawyer had given her in preparation for the next steps in the case, tried to remain calm. When she opened the door, she found two serious-looking officers standing there, their eyes fixed on her. "Are you Mrs. Marcia Alves?" one of them asked, his voice void of emotion. "We have a warrant for your arrest. You are formally charged with abandonment of a vulnerable person with aggravating circumstances of endangerment to life. Please come with us." Marcia felt her legs weaken, nearly unable to stand. At that moment, Fabiano entered the room and saw what was happening, his shock evident. "This is absurd. You can't arrest her like this," he protested, trying to stop the officers from putting the handcuffs on his wife. But Marcia, with a tense calmness, knew that resisting wouldn't help. Her eyes met Fabiano's, and in a voice that trembled but remained firm, she said, "It's okay, Fabiano. Don't worry." Fabiano couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness that washed over him. He knew this moment could come, but witnessing it unfold was something entirely different. As Marcia was taken to the station, Dulce, the woman who had always controlled the family, was in the hospital, battling the aftermath of an attack she'd suffered days before. After days of tension and health complications, her body had given way, leaving her weakened. But her mind remained sharp, aware that there was still something she needed to do before fully surrendering. That afternoon, Fabiano went to the hospital to visit his mother. When he entered her room, he found her pale, yet still wearing that determined expression he had always associated with her. He couldn't help but feel the anger that had been building inside him over the past few days rise to the surface. "Mum, why haven't you told me everything?" he began, his voice heavy with frustration. "All this stuff with Uncle Carlos, the illegal businesses, and now Marcia's in jail. How do you expect me to face all of this?" For the first time, Dulce seemed to hesitate. Fabiano noticed a vulnerability in her that he had never seen before. She took a deep breath before responding. "Because I've always controlled everything, Fabiano. And despite everything I've done, I did it for our family. I did it for you." Fabiano, in disbelief, couldn't stop the words from escaping his mouth. "For our family? You've destroyed everyone's life, and now you refuse to admit your mistakes." Dulce closed her eyes for a moment, as if searching for the right words. When she opened them, there was an unexpected sincerity in her gaze, something Fabiano had never imagined he'd see in her. He was stunned by what he was hearing. Dulce, with an unnerving calm, continued, revealing a plan that he could never have fathomed. "I knew everything, Fabiano," she said, her voice now deep and unwavering. "From the very beginning, everything was predictable. I manipulated the situation so she would fall exactly where I wanted." Fabiano stood frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. Each word felt like another crushing blow. I knew she hated me, that she was plotting to get rid of me, and when I saw the chance, I didn't let it slip away. I did everything I could to make sure she walked straight into my trap. I was the one who framed her, Fabiano. It was all part of my plan. Incredulity overwhelmed Fabiano. He couldn't understand how this was possible. "Why?" he asked, his voice trembling with shock. "Because I needed you to see who she really is," Dulcie replied, her gaze locking onto his with a chilling coldness. "I thought if you saw her as a criminal, you would finally leave her." It was as if the ground had vanished beneath Fabiano's feet. The woman he had always seen as a strong, just, and morally impeccable figure had just revealed the cruelest truth he could have imagined. He tried to take a deep breath, but the words just didn't make sense. "You've destroyed my wife, Mom, and in doing so, you've destroyed me too," Fabiano said, his voice breaking with pain. Donna Dulce looked at him with an expression he had rarely seen on her: genuine regret. It was the kind of regret that couldn't undo the damage she had caused, no matter how sincere it seemed. "I've made more mistakes than I can count," she admitted, turning her gaze away. "But now, I believe it's too late to fix anything." While Fabiano struggled to absorb his mother's words, a mix of confusion and sorrow swirling inside him, across the neighborhood, Salete, the ever-curious neighbor, hadn't stopped her investigation. After much effort, she had managed to track down Carlos Mendonça, Dulce's brother, who now lived in a modest neighborhood far removed from the life he once knew. When Carlos learned of the events, he decided it was time to share his side of the story. "Mom was always manipulative," Carlos confessed to Salete. "She blackmailed me for years. When I tried to expose her, she ruined my reputation. But if I can help Marcia, I will." With Carlos's testimony, Salete gathered documents that revealed the blackmail and money laundering schemes Dulce had been running for years. These papers were handed over to Marcia's lawyer, who now had concrete evidence not just proving Marcia's innocence, but also revealing that she had been a victim, trapped in a system controlled by the ruthless matriarch. Back at the police station, Marcia received the news about the new evidence against Donna Dulce. For the first time in a long while, something stirred inside her, a glimmer of hope, small but real. When Fabiano visited her, she sensed a change in him, as if something had broken inside him, a transformation that she didn't fully understand. "My mother confessed," Fabiano said, sitting in front of her, his voice heavy with the weight of truth. "She knew about your plan all along and manipulated everything to make you look like a criminal." Marcia sat in stunned silence, processing Fabiano's words. She had always suspected the extent of Dulce's control, but she never imagined she was capable of something so cold and calculated. With a trembling voice, torn by inner conflict, she finally asked, "Do you hate me?" Fabiano, looking into Marcia's eyes, knew the situation was far from simple. He wanted to understand everything, but at the same time, he felt that the truth was finally coming to light, clearer and more terrifying than ever before. Fabiano let out a heavy sigh, running his hand over his face as he tried to sort through the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. I don't even know what to feel, Marcia, but I know I can't just ignore what my mother did, even if you didn't do what she did." His voice faltered, but he steadied himself. "I just want to understand how we can get through this together, if there's any way." Marcia stood there, her throat tightening as she fought to keep her emotions in check. The tears were right there, threatening to fall, but she held them back with everything she had. She didn't want to show any more weakness. The future was still a massive question mark, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a sliver of hope, no matter how small it was. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Donna Dulce, worn out from carrying the weight of her own choices, began to crumble. She could no longer run from the truth, and her heart, heavy with regret, pushed her to take the step she'd been dreading. In a final attempt to make amends, she called Fabiano. "I was cruel to you, to Marcia, to everyone," she said, her voice thick with remorse. I hope one day you can forgive me." Fabiano, listening to his mother's words, stayed silent. He gently placed his hand on her, offering a quiet gesture of affection, but said nothing. It was an act of love, yes, but it also carried deep pain. The kind of pain only someone close can inflict. He felt torn, the weight of it all overwhelming. He knew that the future of his family hung on tough decisions and a strength he wasn't sure he had. But one thing he did know was that he didn't want to make the same mistakes his mother had. He didn't want his life to unravel like hers had. Though Marcia was still in prison, the lawyer brought some good news. The new evidence could make all the difference in reducing her sentence or even securing her temporary release. Fabiano, resolute, knew he had to face it all, his family's lies, the betrayals, the lingering doubts. But for the first time in a long while, he felt that there might be a way out, even though the path ahead was fraught with shadows and uncertainty. The abandonment of his mother and the manipulations he knew Marcia had endured revealed a painful truth Fabiano could no longer deny. Marcia wasn't just a victim of Donna Dulce. For years, that same woman had controlled his life, blinding him, shaping his decisions. His mother's constant manipulation had torn everything apart. It was time to break the cycle. When Marcia was finally granted house arrest, the atmosphere in the mansion was thick with tension. Fabiano went to pick her up from the police station, but the drive back was filled with a heavy silence. She looked paler, more worn out than ever, her once cold and calculating eyes now filled with regret and deep uncertainty. When they arrived at the mansion, she paused before stepping inside. "I don't know if I can come back here," she whispered, her voice breaking. Fabiano glanced at her, a mixture of exhaustion and sincerity in his gaze. "Neither do I, but we'll have to face this together, if there's even a way to do it," he said. Marcia nodded, too drained to argue. Both of them knew that despite being under the same roof, there was a vast chasm between them, one that wouldn't be easy to bridge. The following days were a whirlwind of tension, but also small victories. Salete and Giulia, two women who had always remained in the background, became pivotal in Marcia's defense. Salete, ever hungry for attention, surprised everyone when she brought forward concrete evidence against Donna Dulce. She managed to gather secret records and testimonies from Carlos Mendonça, revealing the matriarch for the manipulative woman she truly was. Giulia, on the other hand, shared chilling details about how Dulce had controlled everyone around her, creating a stifling environment that Marcia had never been able to escape. The game was shifting. Still torn between doubt and loyalty to his mother, Fabiano began working closely with the lawyer. He knew that the trial wouldn't just take place in the courtroom, but in the unforgiving eyes of the public, who watched the case unfold with almost morbid curiosity. The newspapers painted him as a man torn between two worlds, while Marcia was portrayed as cold and calculating. However, as days passed, the dark secrets of Donna Dulce began to unravel, creating a scandalous family narrative that rocked society. After days of tension one night, Marcia and Fabiano finally sat down for the conversation they had both been avoiding. They were in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp the only thing illuminating the space. The silence between them was thick, as if the words they were about to say carried more weight than the air itself. "I'm sorry. It's Marcia," she began, her voice faltering with regret. "I know it doesn't mean much now, but I truly am. Not just for what I did to your mother, but for everything I did to you, too." Fabiano looked at her, the pain and exhaustion clear on his face, a mix of conflicting feelings he no longer knew how to navigate. "I want to believe you, Marcia. I want to believe that you're not the person everyone says you are, but you lied. You almost killed my mother." Marcia closed her eyes, trying to hold back the tears that were threatening to fall. "I was blind with hate, from everything she made me go through, how she made me feel so small every day." Her voice trembled, broken by emotion. "I know that doesn't justify what I did, but I want you to know it wasn't to hurt you." The silence that followed was heavy, as if they both carried a shared burden neither could shake off. They knew the path to healing would be long and painful, but for the first time in a long time, they both felt that, maybe together, they could find a way forward. Fabiano remained silent for a few seconds, reflecting on her words. Finally, he spoke, his voice hollow, as if the weight of his words was heavier than he could bear. Maybe you didn't do it to hurt me, but you did. And now I just want to understand if there's still something between us worth saving. Marcia didn't respond right away. A lump formed in her throat as she thought about everything they had been through. For a moment, she considered saying yes, that they could overcome it all, that there was still hope. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. Maybe nothing would ever be the same again. I don't know, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. But I'm willing to try, if you are too. Fabiano simply nodded, saying nothing. They both understood that the road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles, but for the first time in what felt like ages, there was a small flicker of hope between them. Meanwhile, Marcia's defense was gaining momentum in the trial. The process was unfolding, and Salete, who had delivered crucial evidence to the lawyer, had become a key witness, unveiling the dark secrets of Donna Dulce and her controlling behavior. Julia also testified about the abusive atmosphere in the mansion, helping the court see Marcia as more than just a criminal. But the most impactful moment came when Carlos Mendonça, Dulce's brother, was called to the stand. Carlos spoke about how he had been blackmailed by his sister for years, how she had ruined both his personal and professional life to protect her own image. Dulce Alves wasn't just controlling, she was a tyrant. Marcia was just another victim of her manipulation, Carlos said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Those words, those revelations, completely changed how the public saw Marcia. While she was still responsible for her actions, it became clear that her behavior had been shaped by years of psychological abuse and manipulation. As Fabiano sat through the hearings and listened to the testimonies, he began to understand the depths of what Marcia had endured. For the first time, he saw how Donna Dulce had twisted their lives, pitting them against one another to maintain control. One evening, Fabiano found Marcia sitting in the garden, gazing up at the starry sky. He sat beside her, both of them silent, not knowing what to say. After a while, he whispered almost as if to himself, "Do you still want to try again?" Marcia turned her head towards him, surprised by the question. But in her eyes, there was something that spoke louder than any words ever could. "I want to, but only with you," Marcia whispered, her voice trembling. Fabiano nodded, taking a deep breath before responding, "I want that too. I don't know if we'll ever go back to what we were before, but maybe we can try to build something new." And although the future still felt uncertain, that conversation marked the beginning of a new path, a road full of possibilities, and, above all, a hope they both thought they had lost. For the first time in a long while, Marcia felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. In her heart, a small flame of hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild something new, even if different from what they once had. As the case neared its conclusion, it was clear there would still be much to face. But the most important thing was that, for the first time, Fabiano and Marcia stood before the future as allies, determined to break free from the painful legacy of manipulation left behind by Donna Dulce. It was a grey morning when the news hit, as unexpected as a blow to the chest. Fabiano was in the kitchen, brewing a strong coffee, while Marcia skimmed through the latest reports from her defense team. The ringing of the phone shattered the silence between them. Fabiano quickly picked up, and his expression changed immediately. "What happened?" Marcia asked, putting the papers down, sensing that something important was unfolding. Fabiano hung up the phone, took a deep breath and looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "My mother had a heart attack. She's in ICU." Marcia felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Despite everything, Dulce was still Fabiano's mother, and somewhere deep down, despite all the grudges, she knew she needed to be there for him in that moment. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and said, "Let's go to the hospital." The atmosphere at the hospital was thick, suffocating. Dulce lay connected to machines that monitored her fragile state, such a stark contrast to the domineering woman she had once been. The doctor led them to the room, warning them seriously, "She's very weak. If you want to say anything, you should do it now." Fabiano entered first, hesitating as he crossed the threshold, while Marcia stayed at the door, observing. The man who had always seemed so strong now appeared small and vulnerable in the face of his mother's frailty. Dulce, with great effort, opened her eyes and recognized him. She whispered, "Fabiano." He moved closer, taking her hand gently. "I'm here, Mom," he said softly. Dulce, with a barely perceptible gesture, motioned for Marcia to come in. Fabiano hesitated, but gestured for her to enter. Marcia stepped into the room slowly, the beeping of the machines filling the quiet space. Dulce, though exhausted, stared at Marcia with a strange intensity, a stark contrast to her weakened state. Her voice barely audible, but her words were clear. "I was cruel to you, to everyone. I did terrible things that still haunt me." Marcia, her heart torn, didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to accept the moment, to hear the words of regret, but another part still carried the weight of the scars Dulce had left. Finally, she spoke, her voice firm, but without malice. "I don't know if I can forgive everything." Dulce nodded slowly, as if she had anticipated this answer. "I don't expect you to, but I needed to say that everything I did was out of fear. Fear of losing control, fear of losing my family, and in the end, I lost everything." Her gaze shifted to Fabiano, and a few tears welled in her eyes. "I'm sorry, son, for everything, for trying to control your life and destroying so many others in the process." Fabiano, his own eyes filled with tears, gently squeezed her hand, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I forgive you, Mom, but you need to rest." A faint smile appeared on Dulce's lips just before her breathing grew uneven. The monitors began to emit a continuous sound, a warning signal, and doctors rushed into the room. Fabiano and Marcia were quickly ushered out, leaving them alone with the weight of the imminent loss. The funeral was quiet, simple, and without fanfare, a subdued farewell to a woman whose secrets and shadows had finally come to light. Only a handful of people showed up, and Fabiano kept his distance throughout the ceremony. It wasn't just the grief of losing his mother, but the weight of a legacy he never asked for, but now, at long last, seemed ready to leave behind. Marcia stood by his side, silent, offering her support without uttering a word. She understood that this was the turning point for both of them, the moment when they would begin to heal at last. Weeks later, the court's verdict arrived. Marcia was acquitted thanks to the damning evidence against Dulce and the testimonies from Julia, Salete, and Carlos Mendonça. They had exposed the toxic and abusive environment in which Marcia had lived. It was clear that she had been a victim of extreme psychological manipulation. Her act of abandoning Dulce on the road was now seen as a desperate move, one that had never been meant to cause any serious harm. When Marcia heard the verdict, a deep sense of relief washed over her, something she hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, Dulce's shadow no longer hung over her as they walked out of the courthouse. Fabiano took her hand, and for the first time in a while, Marcia allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them after all. A month later, Marcia and Fabiano began rebuilding their lives. Though the scars remained, they were both willing to try again. One evening, as they were preparing dinner together, Marcia paused, uncertain. Fabiano looked at her, sensing her unease. "Fabiano, I need to tell you something." Her voice trembled slightly as she pulled a pregnancy test from her bag, one she had found a few days earlier. The silence that followed was broken by a smile slowly spreading across Fabiano's face. He moved toward her, pulling her into a tight embrace, as if this was the sign of a new beginning for both of them. "This is a new chance for us, Marcia," he whispered. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcia smiled genuinely, a happiness that had been absent for years filling her heart. "Yes, Fabiano, for all of us." As they looked toward the future, they both knew the path wouldn't be easy. The wounds still needed time to heal, and trust would have to be earned back, piece by piece. But now, there was something that bound them together once again, a promise to face whatever came next with honesty, and the firm commitment to never let the past control them again. Hand in hand, they walked toward the garden of the Alves mansion, where, under the soft glow of the evening light, they decided that this new opportunity was all they needed to start over. Did you enjoy today's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave a like and share it with your friends. We'll see you in the next video.